Prime Minister Mark Carney is trying to reassure Canadians after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to raise tariffs on Canada by another 10%. Speaking at the ASEAN Leaders Summit in Malaysia.
In this episode, we'll talk about the most pressing issues affecting Canada and the world: trade problems, hurricanes, high-profile thefts, and even school strikes. It's all in our review. What happened when the U.S. president unexpectedly hit Canada with threats of new tariffs? How did this affect relations between the countries? And why is the Prime Minister willing to take the risk? But that's not all.
It is the sole responsibility of the Government of Canada to have those discussions with the United States, and it's the best way forward.
How did local advertising in Canada cause diplomatic tensions to escalate? And why did one of the governors decide to intervene in this dispute? At the same time, an important summit is taking place in Asia, where Canada will have to choose how to deal with new threats to trade and find ways to expand its influence on the international stage. And despite threats from the East, the Canadian government is continuing its efforts to establish favorable agreements in other parts of the world. Can this strategy restore the country's economic advantage when the U.S. seems to be escalating tensions? In addition, we cannot ignore the tragic events in the Caribbean. A powerful hurricane is approaching Jamaica, threatening to destroy everything in its path. How are the island's residents preparing to face this natural monster, and what measures are being taken on the eve of the most severe storm warning?
Carney said he is ready to resume trade talks with the U.S. while also focusing on expanding trade ties across Asia. As Mackenzie Gray reports, the Prime Minister also appeared to send a message to Ontario's Premier.
A Category 5 hurricane is a disaster that could leave thousands homeless and cause catastrophic consequences. But more importantly, what can these storms tell us about climate change? But as important as that is, we have an equally tense situation to deal with at home. In Alberta, after 3 weeks of strike action, teachers are back in the spotlight. The province is deciding how to force teachers back into the classroom. Will a law that violates collective bargaining rights be enforced? And how will this affect the lives of 700,000 students who have not been attending school for almost a month? This bill could set a precedent that will affect the entire education system in the country. But if the government takes such measures, what will happen next?
The Premier of Ontario seems to have come off the rails a little. He has taken the ads down, but what's the purpose of that other than to try to sway U.S. public opinion?
While in France, police are investigating a major robbery at the Louvre involving the theft of tens of millions of dollars worth of jewelry, the situation in Ukraine remains tense. With new missile strikes on the capital and threats to destroy infrastructure, the international community is finding new ways to respond to the aggression. What will happen next? And how will it affect global security? Don't miss your chance to learn all the details and understand what is happening in the world and how it may affect us in the near future. Watch our episode and stay up to date with the most important events. Amid growing economic turmoil and tensions between Canada and the U.S., Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney found himself at the center of crucial diplomatic and trade negotiations.
It's not the YMCA, but Donald Trump seemed to love his welcome to Malaysia. The jet lag not affecting the president after he blasted Canada on social media at 4:30 a.m. local time.
It all started when U.S. President Donald Trump once again threatened to increase tariffs on Canadian goods by 10%. This statement was part of a broader political game in which the U.S. is trying to force Canada to concede on trade issues in order to secure better terms for American manufacturers. Although Carney stated that Canada was ready for negotiations and even proposed a strategy to expand trade ties in Asia, the situation escalated to the breaking point. Trump, who has long been skeptical of many international agreements, has made a new threat with a clear goal: to change the rules of the game in trade and increase economic pressure on Canada. He made these threats in response to an advertising campaign organized by the Ontario government that was directed against American tariffs. The ad, which called for free trade and warned of negative consequences for consumers, provoked a fierce reaction from the U.S. president. He accused Canada of interfering in U.S. internal affairs, saying it was trying to manipulate American public opinion by influencing elections scheduled to take place next month. Canada has no right to interfere in U.S. affairs, Trump said in a tweet.
The government of Canada stands ready to build on the progress that we had been making in our negotiations, our discussions with our American counterparts.
He said the decision to raise tariffs was made in response to the inappropriate behavior of the Canadian authorities, and that the decision was aimed at protecting the interests of American producers. Interestingly, at the time Trump made this statement, data was released showing that the U.S. economy continued to face difficulties in certain sectors, such as agriculture and metallurgy, and the tariff increase on Canada was seen as an attempt to solve these problems through foreign trade. But the situation was not so clear-cut. In response to Trump's threat, Prime Minister Carney made a statement saying that Canada was ready to negotiate, but on its own terms. He emphasized that Canada would continue to seek alternative trade routes by expanding economic ties with Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, in order to reduce its dependence on the U.S. and become more independent on the international stage. At the same time, he also stated that the government would be ready to resume trade negotiations with the U.S. if the latter showed a constructive approach. However, in Toronto itself, as well as in other Canadian cities, the authorities began to realize that the situation required urgent measures.
Handshake? Yep. Oh, the handshake. Yes, that makes it official.
Ontario, facing a wave of criticism for its advertising campaign, which provoked increased tensions, decided to temporarily suspend the advertising. Prime Minister Carney continued to insist that the campaign's goal was only to express the country's position and stressed that such initiatives should not overshadow important diplomatic relations. He stressed that Canada's future in international politics depends on its ability to maintain open and honest negotiations. At the same time, in response to Trump's threats, a meeting was held during the ASEAN summit in Malaysia, where the Prime Minister met with leaders from Southeast Asian countries. At this summit, Carney emphasized that Canada is seeking to expand trade relations with Asian countries.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Shortly after the summit, the Canadian government announced its intention to begin negotiations on new trade agreements with the states belonging to this bloc. However, despite all diplomatic efforts, tensions in relations with the U.S. have not subsided. Returning to the consequences for the economy, it is worth noting that the U.S. has always been Canada's most important trading partner. But as recent events have shown, uncertainty in relations with the American side is putting serious pressure on the Canadian economy. Canadian analysts argue that if the tariff increases come into effect, it could seriously affect Canadian exports, especially in areas such as agriculture, engineering, and automotive manufacturing.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
These industries will be particularly at risk, as the U.S. will seek to protect its own production capacity and workers. In addition, according to the Canadian press, the White House is not ready to disclose exactly which goods will be subject to the new tariff blow and when it will take effect. This only adds to the uncertainty among Canadian business people who are waiting for clarity so they can prepare for the possible consequences. many Canadian companies have already begun to develop strategies to diversify their supplies in order to reduce their dependence on the U.S. and minimize potential losses. Meanwhile, Canadian diplomats supporting Carney's strategy have begun negotiations with other countries to strengthen the country's position on the international stage. Particular attention is being paid to establishing new trade agreements with the European Union, as well as deepening economic ties with Japan and South Korea.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
These countries are considered key players in the global economy and provide Canada with opportunities to reduce its economic dependence on the U.S. In any case, the situation with tariffs and trade negotiations remains the focus of attention for the Canadian authorities, and the future of the country's economy depends on how this situation develops. Foreign policy and diplomacy play a key role in these negotiations, and despite the difficulties, the Canadian authorities are prepared to do everything possible to protect their country's interests and ensure stability on the international stage. For Canadians, this is also an important moment to reflect on how the national economy and foreign policy can develop in a context of global uncertainty. Will Canada continue to seek new ways to strengthen its trade position, or will it find itself embroiled in an even tougher trade war with the U.S.? This remains a question that needs to be answered against the backdrop of worsening relations between Canada and the U.S. When the situation with tariffs and trade negotiations reached its peak, the Canadian authorities began to look toward other markets and allies. Prime Minister Carney, clearly concerned about the possible consequences for the economy, decided to intensify efforts to diversify trade relations.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The focus was on expanding cooperation with Southeast Asia, which has experienced rapid economic growth in recent years and has become an increasingly important trading partner for many countries, including Canada. Carney traveled to the ASEAN summit, which presented a crucial moment for Canadian diplomacy: the opening of new trade routes with neighboring countries. The summit provided a platform for negotiations with high-profile leaders from countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia to conclude agreements that could not only strengthen Canada's trading position in the region, but also create an alternative to economic dependence on the United States.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
At the summit, which was also attended by Donald Trump, Carney reiterated that Canada was prepared to continue negotiations with its American partners, but as recent weeks have shown, the U.S. often acts on the principle of unilateral gain. This statement came in response to growing dissatisfaction with the U.S.'s negotiating tactics, which were increasingly perceived as aggressive and disadvantageous to Canada. The reaction to this statement was not long in coming. Leaders in Southeast Asia enthusiastically welcomed Canada's intentions to establish closer economic ties. Malaysia, for example, offered Canada the opportunity to increase supplies of agricultural products such as grain and meat, which would be beneficial to both sides. In turn, Carney proposed expanding trade in technology and innovation, which could give Canada access to the region's rapidly growing high-tech and electronic device markets.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
However, not everything went so smoothly. Against the backdrop of these negotiations, it became clear that the U.S. was not going to tolerate Canadian diplomats trying to strengthen economic ties with countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam, which have been actively promoting their goods in European and U.S. markets over the past few years. Trump, who, as it turned out, was following the summit with particular attention, immediately issued a new threat to Carney. He said that the U.S. would apply economic pressure not only on Canada, but also on those countries that would conclude lucrative deals with it. We will not tolerate our trading partners cooperating with Canada to the detriment of American interests, Trump said, sharply condemning any attempts to expand trade ties between Canada and Southeast Asian countries.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
These statements have caused concern among Canadian economists and diplomats. Many international trade experts have begun to calculate the possible consequences of tougher U.S. sanctions if Canada manages to conclude lucrative agreements with Asian countries. Several large Canadian companies have already stated that they could face problems if the U.S. begins to restrict their ability to do business with new partners. This has created additional uncertainty amid existing trade threats, leading to a sharp drop in the Canadian dollar in the days following Trump's new threat. Despite these difficulties, Canada has still managed to achieve some success on the international stage.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Following the ASEAN summit, where memoranda of understanding were signed with several countries, such as Vietnam and Indonesia, Carney held a series of meetings with representatives of the Chinese government. Carney made no secret of his desire to improve relations with China, despite the recent escalation of the trade war between the two global giants. Despite the difficulties, Canada managed to agree on the creation of a new trade corridor that would significantly increase the supply of Canadian goods to China and other countries in the region. During this meeting, the Chinese side expressed interest in possible cooperation in the fields of agriculture, technology, and energy resources. Carney stressed that it would be important for Canada not only to increase trade volumes, but also to diversify its sources of supply so as not to depend exclusively on one market, in particular the U.S.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Given these prospects, Canada could not only reduce the impact of U.S. policy on its economy, but also secure a stable place for itself in the global trading arena. Against the backdrop of these foreign economic efforts, Canada is increasingly concerned about the political reactions that are emerging in response to the aggressive trade policy of the United States. In particular, attention has been focused on the potential increase in tariffs on Canadian goods, which Trump announced a few days ago. Recognizing the need to take steps to protect its economy, the Canadian government has continued to strengthen ties with new allies in both Asia and Europe. However, the main task was not only to establish stable trade, but also to maintain the confidence of Canadian voters, who, despite external threats, continued to support Carney's strategy. Negotiations with China led Canada to seek new ways to strengthen its position in the world. A concept was proposed to expand economic cooperation with the European Union, which included several key areas: the development of new technologies and innovations, as well as the expansion of agricultural and energy supplies to Europe. These efforts were intended to be a response to growing economic and political pressure from the United States. But more importantly, all this diplomatic activity underscored one simple fact: